Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to wait about 5 minutes just to let more attendees hop on. So just get settled in right now. Thanks for joining us. Hi, I'm seeing some questions in the chat that people can't hear us. We're all on mute right now. We're just working out a technical difficulty right now so we can make sure that everybody can view the participants. Aloha, everyone. Sorry about those slight technical difficulties and for the slight delay. We were just working out a Zoom kink, and there happens to be many. I think all of our Zooms are a little bit overwhelmed right now. But thank you for joining us today and for joining our Gender to the Center, Gender Diverse and Trans Experiences in Hawaii webinar, co-hosted by AF3IRM Hawaiʻi and the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. My name is Michal Hamid, and I am one of the co-coordinators of AF3IRM Hawaiʻi. And I'm going to be facilitating and joining in on this wonderful and necessary conversation today. So just a little bit about AF3IRM Hawaiʻi. We're a group of transnational, anti-imperialist, trans-inclusive, queer, Black, Brown, and Indigenous POC feminists, and we center the most targeted and vulnerable in our society. So we've witnessed and experienced firsthand the commodification of our ancestral lands and through imperialism and colonialism, and how this led to the commodification of our bodies and lives, specifically as women and non-men under Western heteropatriarchy. And one of the reasons why we focus so much on these connections is because this is our lived experience, and this is the lived experience of the global majority. A little bit about the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. The Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women is a statewide feminist agency that seeks to work towards equality for women, girls, and all femme-identified people in Hawaii. So today our dialogue will be centering the experiences of Kanaka, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as these voices are unfortunately often left out of the conversation about contemporary gender identity, particularly regarding the gender binary. So much so, in fact, that a lot of people misunderstand identifying as non-binary or using they, them pronouns as being a quote unquote white thing, which we know is not true and it's not the case. We know that our communities and our ancestors not only rejected the gender binary, but they also protested against it and fought against it for the majority of their lives under the system. So we envision this dialogue to be a space, an opportunity to educate and hold space for our intersecting communities and identities. We see ourselves as deserving liberation for our whole selves, and we will stop at nothing less. So we welcome all of your identities and all of our backgrounds as we embark on this journey together. And this includes liberation from Western patriarchal notions of gender, specifically the gender binary. So let's give a little bit of context for those that might not be coming from Hawaii or tuning in from Hawaii. So the Western gender binary came to Hawaii through missionaries and colonialism. It was not something that was natural, and it was not something that existed in Hawaiian society before missionaries in the way that it is now. Much like other imposed colonial systems in Hawaii, like prisons, private property, the sex trade, privatized healthcare, the imposition of the gender binary greatly transformed society, particularly cultural understandings of gender, both for Kanaka and the settlers that would live in Hawaii. So for Kanaka Maoli and other Black and Indigenous people of color, those are the most that are harmed under this Western gender binary system. And we've seen this rampant rise in the normalization of violence against our communities, particularly those that don't fit within the gender binary. We've seen a rise in patriarchal violence, in femicides, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sex trafficking. And so this conversation is really meant to center those that are most impacted by the violence of the Western patriarchal gender binary. So to introduce our wonderful, wonderful panelists today, let's welcome Jen Jenkins, a public policy advocate and graduate from the William S. Richardson School of Law. Jen's fierce leadership led to the Gender X License Bill, which is the first of its kind in all occupied places and territories of the United States, which is a huge win, and allows for a gender marker X to be placed on a state identification ID or a driver's license, which allows for a gender marker other than male or female to be chosen. Jen also serves as the community co-chair on the Department of Health Sexual and Gender Minority Work Group. And this work group just released a sex and gender minority online resource hub in honor of Pride that can be found on the Department of Health website. So you should go check it out. It's a really great resource toolkit, especially for young folks. Next, let's welcome Jamaica Heolimeleikalani Osorio, an assistant professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian and Native politics at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. You may recognize Dr. Osorio from her internationally renowned slam poetry competitions or her role as a kia'i on Mauna Kea protecting the Mauna from the TMT. Dr. Osorio also recently led a 2020 cohort of Na Ko'oko'o Native Hawaiian leadership program that was very successful. Dr. Osorio's dissertation, Remembering Upena of Intimacies, a Kanaka Maoli Mo'olelo Beyond Queer Theory, explores the pilina and relationships in the mo'olelo of Hi'iaka i Kapolio Pele and offers a Kanaka Maoli alternative to settler logics of heterosexism, cis heteropatriarchy, and heteronormativity. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this will be a forthcoming book too, so it will be accessible soon, which is really exciting, and I can't wait to read it. And lastly, let's welcome my fellow AF3IRM Hawaiʻi co-coordinator, Alexandra Balgos. Alex is a working class feminist, community advocate, and organizer for women, girls, and non-binary folks in Hawaii. Her work has been featured in Star Advertiser, and Alex is currently working on a project highlighting the gendered connections between colonization and land. So let's welcome all of our amazing participants. I'm so excited that we're all here to have this really necessary discussion. And technical difficulties, sorry. I don't know, there we go. So thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited for you all to be here. And we're gonna start off with a couple of guiding questions, but this is really meant to be more of a discussion between our really awesome crew of people that we have here. And our first question is around the use of pronouns in the English language and how your relationship with pronouns in the English language has changed or perhaps evolved over time as, you know, Black and Indigenous people of color who may have a somewhat tenuous relationship with pronouns in the English language or pronouns that adhere to a somewhat Western system. So we want to hear what is your you know, experience been navigating these kind of questions and this process of coming to terms with pronouns.
I can start off. So yeah, I'm Jen, and my pronouns are they, them. And that experience for me was, I originally used only she, her pronouns. And then I switched to using they, them for a few reasons. Definitely because I don't fit into the Western notion of the gender binary. So I don't identify as strictly female or strictly male. So she wouldn't be wrong, but it wouldn't be right either. And same for he. So when I felt comfortable enough with my understanding of being non-binary, I decided to switch to using they, them pronouns. And it really took a lot of unlearning, like a sort of a Western thought process that I had to be the way society was telling me I had to be, or I had to use these pronouns because these are my only options. And it really took me being around people who authentically used they, them pronouns for me to feel comfortable with it, because it wasn't, it's not exactly like normal or common here in Hawaii, or I guess many places, many colonized places especially. And so it's definitely a process. It's still a process today, but I feel it. So not only is it just like my identity, but it's also like almost a political act, because I'm saying, hey, that there are these other options. Like I don't fit into this, and it's okay. And I hope that it signals to anybody else who may feel like they don't fit into either of these roles, or their gender is fluid, or whatever it might be, that hey, there is something else, because that's what it did for me when I saw people just being themselves. So yeah, that's just my perspective on it.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Jen. And I think I resonate a lot with what you shared about not really fitting into the Western concept of what a woman or a man is. And personally, I feel like I have a complicated relationship with pronouns because in my head, I don't ascribe a gender to myself. I use she, they pronouns because for the most part, I do present feminine and experience the same systemic violence that comes with womanhood, but I also want to hold space for the fact that I don't fit into like Western ideals of womanhood, like I think about non-binary as like being not entirely woman or entirely man, but like you think about what it means to actually be entirely either. These ideas are like Western impositions, aren't they? So this is kind of where I struggle with identifying either way, but I guess this is the journey.
I have a strange relationship with pronouns. I grew up being misgendered a lot. And in fact, it got me into a lot of fights. I got into a lot of fights in elementary school. And I actually can't remember, with the exception of one time that I punched a kid because he said Hawaiians were stupid. I can't remember a single fight that didn't revolve around someone calling me a boy. And so there was obviously a part of me that when someone said that, like I knew that that made me feel wrong. Right. So like I had internalized these ideas of the way that I was meant to present, and someone was like calling me out on that. But as I've gotten older, it hasn't, being misgendered only really bothers me when people correct my father, like that they think that he's misgendering me, like the audacity of folks to think that they would know me better than my own father does. And so when I think about this issue of gender pronouns and misgendering, to me, it's a lot about intimacy. And so unlike other folks, I don't introduce myself with my pronouns. My first experience with pronouns and like that question, like what are your pronouns, was an affluent white gay man asking me on our very first encounter with each other. And to be completely honest, I was really offended by the question because he was a stranger to me and he was a stranger to everything that I was. And so I understand kind of the use of the question. I understand oftentimes where it's coming from as a way to like make space and to more fully welcome those of us who don't fit into the binary into the space. But to be completely honest, usually my experience with the question is really off-putting. Because most times when people ask it, I feel like they're mostly trying to affix me somewhere so that they can make sense of where I am into relation to where they are and to like put me in this place. And from my perspective as a Hawaiian, we don't gender things. We don't gender objects. We don't gender names. We don't gender pronouns. We have plenty of pronouns, but all they do is they tell you the relationship between the speaker and the person and who they're speaking with. So these are the things like I think about a lot when people ask me about pronouns in the English language. I think about how in my language, when someone's talking to me or about me, it's immaterial if I'm kane or wahine or mahu. And of course, that has everything to do with the fact that that time that my kupuna grew up in wasn't dominated by patriarchy, right? And so for me, I think a lot of this question is like a really, really intimate question. And so I try to think about how folks present themselves and how folks tell me they want me to relate to them, and how I can best like respect that and hold others accountable to respecting that. But I've never identified with any pronouns. Like she is fine, whatever, they, them is fine. He is fine, because the language, I don't identify with the language. I don't find home in that language. And so I think I'm more in a place of refusal, like entire refusal, than trying to accommodate myself into even the growing language of expanding these pronouns beyond the binary. So I don't know, that's where I'm at right in this very moment.
Just to add to that a little bit too, so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that our pronouns don't necessarily represent our gender, right? So just because someone has certain pronouns, it doesn't mean that that's the gender they identify with. And also I think it's important for us to like kind of keep in mind too that gender expression is different than gender identity. So the way a person may, the way I may present myself, you may want to associate a gender with that, but that wouldn't necessarily, may not be the case. And I think that's really, it's really important what Jamaica just noted, just how it's an intimate kind of conversation, and to it's important not to make assumptions about people, but for us to get to know one another in a way that we can communicate that without like interrogating and saying, what are your pronouns? Because it really shouldn't be that type of communication. It should be an intimate connection, and you feel comfortable and safe enough to not even need to really know that about a person. So yeah, I just wanted to say that too.
I think this point that you're also needing to touch on is right, this intimate relationship with the way that we communicate gender and gender identity. And, you know, to Heoli's point about, you know, this cis, affluent, gay, white man, you know, approaching you and kind of asking you this very intimate question, it to me is very emblematic of the environment of what is deemed to be LGBTQ spaces in Hawaii, because so much of it has been dominated by this kind of white cis narrative of what you know, it means to be an LGBTQ person, what it means to be a queer person. And I think our next question kind of really touches upon that, because for many people, they see Hawaii as, you know, this gay paradise, you know, this paradise where people, it was, you know, one of the first states to be accepting of legal gay marriage. And it's this, you know, wonderful, wonderful place to be for gay and LGBTQ people. And so how has Hawaii being kind of marketed as the global, you know, LGBTQ movement impacted your experience navigating gender identity in Hawaii, in navigating an experience that you don't really align with, you know, compared to, you know, a white cis experience? Can you all speak a little bit to that?
I can jump in. So I think at the like front of this question, right, the gay friendly paradise, anything that projects Hawaii as a paradise is a bad thing, right? Anything that does that is doing so for the benefit of a small few at the expense of most often people who come from my genealogy and who have lived and worked in these lands for generations. And so at the very center of that is something really, really offensive to me, right? It's something that's trying to fuel tourism and trying to fuel this capitalistic, extractive experience in Hawaii, that so long as you have the resources, this is an experience that you can buy your way into. And of course, as a Hawaiian, I take like extreme offense to that. And so for a lot of reasons, the whole debate around same-sex marriage in Hawaii in 2013-ish was really hard to sit through, because, you know, I'm not that into marriage at all to begin with, but also like I'm not into saying that anyone who wants to get married shouldn't get married. And so the whole debate of it really brought out a lot of these issues over, for the most part, who was going to organize on the side of same-sex marriage, and what were the kinds of, what was their vision for what Hawaii was going to be? And am I in alignment with that vision? When I think about this question, I think about the one and only time that I went to Pride in Honolulu. I think I was like a senior in high school. And all I saw were like these rich haole men, mostly, making a mess of my aina on vacation. And that's not to say that Pride hasn't changed for the better in 10 years. But to me, the same thing that markets Hawaii as a gay-friendly paradise is what makes Hawaii less for Hawaiians. And like, as anytime I step into a space that feels like this isn't a space for Hawaiians, it's something that I immediately kind of want to reject. And I think that's a problem with the gay-friendly paradise, not so much the problem with the celebration of Pride, if we can like detangle those two things. And I think it makes it really hard for Indigenous people on our own land to actually navigate our own genders and sexual expressions when we find so much contention between ourselves and the mainstream queer community, right? White stream queer community. So it's just another violence, right? That's piling on top of each other.
Pride is extremely capitalist, and I understand the intent, but the impact is like leaves a lot to be desired. And Marsha P. Johnson said, "No pride for any of us without liberation for all of us." And I don't see that. I mean, for Indigenous people in the queer and trans community, but for BIPOC people in general in the trans and queer community, you'll see corporations putting out a lot of money catering to typically it's white cis gay men, but you'll have trans women of color who are being murdered, and like there's zero acknowledgement from these corporations. And then there's I don't think I've ever seen a land acknowledgement at Pride for being here in the Hawaiian Kingdom. So it's just things like that that are just glaringly missing from Pride, and it'd be great if that could be included, and it would be an amazing shift. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, just co-signing everything that Jen and Jamaica have brought up about how like the commodification and marketing of this place and the way that it feeds into like this paradise discourse, and it all contributes to like settler colonialism, and it kind of like cheapens the landscape, and like I don't know. And I think this affects the authenticity of like my personal relationship with gender identity, just because like how can I ID as LGBT when that label is being used to feed the settler colonial project to like promote the desecration of this land through tourism, like, and of course, yeah, it obscures the real violence that queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people are experiencing here. So yeah, just all of that.
Jen, you brought up a really, really great point about how Pride is this, like capitalist project that has kind of, in my view, like watered down the real revolutionary intent, right, of reclaiming and occupying spaces. And your point about, you've never been at Pride with a land acknowledgement, I think that really speaks volumes to the culture that's kind of, surrounding all of these kinds of acts of the LGBT community kind of expressing themselves. And it doesn't necessarily leave a lot of space for, Black and Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ folks. And I think, even if every single Pride gave a land acknowledgement, right? Sure, it would be a step, but it doesn't necessarily change the actual, sovereign position of all of the Indigenous people and the tribal land and the occupied land that they're living on. And so I think, to me, that just is another indication that the movement that we're kind of a part of in creating space and making sure that we're holding it, not just for, a part of ourselves, like, oh, the gay part or the non-binary part of ourselves, but really for our whole selves to be liberated, because we know that, it's all connected together. And there's no way to detangle, these connections.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to consider what it means, because we can use the land acknowledgement as like a barometer for lowest common freaking denominator. I'm not good at math. Lowest common denominator, right? For demonstrating that at least you think about Indigenous people, that they exist. But even the idea, like, what does it mean to gather in a place and to celebrate celebrate your ability to fully express who you are on lands where the indigenous people are unable to gather and celebrate the expression of themselves, right? So like, there's a fundamental issue there that I think we're kind of all commenting on that is just sticking at the front of my head as to why maybe I probably won't end up at a pride in Hawaii again in my lifetime. And that's okay. There are plenty of other places that I can celebrate. But
to the kind of opposite end, you know, where we first kind of talked about the violence of this paradise depiction of Hawaii as a gay paradise, particularly for those that are the most privileged. How has connecting with your kupuna and your ancestors provide guidance and kind of shaped your journey navigating a world that's structured around Western patriarchal, you know, gender binary norms, and has that process brought you to one specific conclusion or many?
So for like connecting in my family, where like my ancestry goes back to like the transatlantic slave trade. So there's a huge disconnect for me when it comes to like being able to look to my ancestors, because I don't know exactly where, what part of Africa they're from. And then of course, I also don't know, like, I mean, the enslavers are in my DNA too. But I do have like the trans and queer movement leaders. So like, and of course, like Black queer feminists. And I look to them for like, for knowledge and to be myself. And I know that I wouldn't be at the point that I'm at and like my growing into myself and like learning about myself if it weren't for specifically like Black trans women being themselves and like putting themselves out there, because that's just who they were. And moments like Stonewall and other like uprisings and rebellions that have just had to happen over and over again because we were continuously oppressed just for being us. So like that's who I really have looked to like on this journey that I'm on with gender and like in relation to the world that we live in today.
I tell my students a lot, especially my Hawaiian students, or I remind them, maybe I don't have to tell them, but I remind them how lucky we are that we know who our kupuna are. And when we think about the different ways that colonialism has moved throughout the world, how so much of it has been about this disruption of relationships. And so for a lot of our comrades in struggle, like they don't have the benefit of knowing who their kupuna are and what aina they're from. And so I take that as like a heightened responsibility to like do that research because we have access to it. When I was growing up, I thought of, honestly, I didn't think about my sexuality much at all when I was growing up, but sexuality was presented to me as something that would be an appendage to who I am, right? I'm a Hawaiian woman who, if I dated women, meant I was a Hawaiian woman who was a lesbian, right? I'm a Hawaiian woman who's queer. Or Hawaiian wahine, who's queer, whatever. And I think somewhere along those lines, I kind of internalized this idea that being queer made me less Hawaiian. And one of the really wonderful things about going back to my kupuna, who like, I didn't grow up with a lot of what we might call like contemporary queer ancestors, right? There wasn't really a vision in my mind. I didn't have people in my family who were openly gay. It's not like I had a family that was homophobic, but there just weren't those figures in my life to look to. There wasn't this brilliant and beautiful move. Anyway, so I thought they were two separate things. And then the more that I read into my history and the more that I learned about people like Hi'iaka or other kupuna from our mo'olelo, the more I realized that these things weren't separate. And the reason that we don't have a word for lesbians or queer people in our language is not because we didn't exist, but because we didn't think of ourselves in those ways. We didn't compartmentalize ourselves in these kinds of sexual identities. And we thought really really intimately about relationships and the way that we entered into relationships and the way that we practice intimacy and pleasure with each other, but there was no need to ever mark ourselves as someone who sleeps with someone of the same sex, right? So this is something that, yeah, it's helped me kind of unpack and navigate what it means to live in 2019 in this world that's so ruled by patriarchy and the gender binary that, like, I can't go to freaking Subway without the guy calling me sir 6 times. Like, he doesn't know how to relate to me unless he can identify some kind of gender. But more importantly than that, like, yeah, great, it helps me navigate that space. But more importantly than that, it's helped me understand what it means to be Hawaiian in a more intimate and fundamental level. It's helped me understand my body better and to kind of take ownership and pleasure in my body in a way that I don't think would have been possible for me personally without the guidance of those stories. So for like anyone who's tuning in, who's Kanaka and doesn't know those stories and is still struggling with what it means to be a queer person in this genealogy, just want to let you know that they're freaking everywhere. And, you know, the more you can get connected with them, the better, I think.
Yeah. So my connection to my ancestors, I don't quite know who they are. I'm Filipino, and I've tried doing genealogy things, and they only ever go back to like early 1900s. But anyway, that's besides the point. But I mean, I wouldn't say that I can speak with my ancestors, but for whatever reason, I like know that they speak to me through my intuition. So I think that's what I really believe, is that my ancestors speak to me through my intuition, and they're kind of like a guiding light to my authentic self. And when I feel like particularly like lost in this colonial mess, I think about how my ancestors who lived through colonialism may have had these similar troubles of adapting to these colonial impositions of gender and sexuality, and like having that thought that they are going through the same things that I might be living through now is, I don't know, it gives me hope. And I wake up and live my truth, and I don't shy away from who I am, and that reminds me that like one day I'm going to be an ancestor, and it makes me hopeful for the generations to come, I guess.
Na'o is such a beautiful thing, like intuition and like all the ways that our kupuna will talk to us. So important.
We have a couple questions coming in from the audience, and one of them, let's see, I can pull it up. Kekoa is asking, Kekoa is saying, I feel a similar break with corporate watered down pride. I've been to Boston, Honolulu, and San Francisco Pride. And Kekoa is wondering if Dr. Osorio and everyone else can speak more about how pride can be more intersectional and acknowledging not just gender, sex, gender identity, sexuality liberation, but also liberation for Indigenous peoples, particularly perhaps. Is it possible to make these Western constructs more intersectional? Is it appropriate to even need to adapt to Western structures to be more congruent with our Pacific Islander culture and communities? It's a good question.
That's a big question. I'm rereading it because I have horrible listening comprehension. It's a fun fact about me. Speak more about pride. Okay, so I'm not the best person to talk about this because I'm not really a pride person, and like my immediate gut reaction is pride shouldn't be in this particular issue in Hawaii. Pride shouldn't be the focus, and rather the focus should be how can we come together as queer folks in Hawaii to decolonize ourselves and our relationship to this place. And if at some point that looks like a celebration, then great. But what's more important to me is everyone in Hawaii developing more ethical relationships to Indigenous people and Indigenous land. I can't really get past there and talking about making Pride more intersectional. Pride's not the focus. And some people might not like that answer, but that's what I got. It's the only one I have.
I know it wasn't directed at me, but Dr. Osorio made me think of the Mānoa and the pride flags and the spaces, the safe spaces that were created on the Mānoa. And I think that was probably the best example of what she's getting at, because it was like it was a true like celebration of Indigenous people and all the intersectionalities. I mean, it was incredible to be up there and to witness that. So like examples like that, that's pride to me.
And I think what happened on the Mānoa with the creation of those safe spaces, the Hale Manamahu and the Hale Manawahine, one of the really important things that it reminded us or kept us vigilant of is the ways that within our own community as Hawaiians that we need to do a lot of unlearning and decolonizing within ourselves, right? So I hope I don't come off as people thinking that I'm saying that Hawaiians don't have work to do. And I think Jen's example is a really great one to talk about how these things come together as a safe space for celebration and honoring our full selves, but also as a site of resistance within the movement too, of pushing the movement forward. That was really both functional and beautiful.
So speaking of the Mānoa, a lot of the folks that we're kind of the stewards of creating Hale Manawahine and Hale Manamahu really grounded themselves in the intersectional and Indigenous queer feminism that they not only practice, but they teach as well. And I want to hear a little bit about how the feminist movement at large, but specifically the kind of demand from, I guess, non-liberal feminists, the demand to end patriarchy, right, and to end the division of power and structuring of power placed in men's possession has impacted your relationship with gender roles, and if it has impacted your relationship with your gender identity.
I mean, I can speak to this a little bit, I guess. Just the fear, the feminist movement, like specifically going for the patriarchy or trying to undo what it's doing to us. It's in large part just seeing gender roles like completely be obliterated in certain instances has been huge, because it allowed my brain to be like, oh, hey, like being gendered as man doesn't necessarily have to be this stereotype that we all think of. It can be, I don't even want to call it effeminate. It's just, it can be a like a spectrum or a continuum of male and female. And 1 minute a typical gender role can be doing that, whatever you expect them to do. And then the next they can be doing something completely different, and that's okay. And the feminist movement has just really challenged our thought process, and that's, I think, what allows us to kind of, as a trans non-binary person, for speaking for myself, like allows me to be able to say, hey, I don't have to perform this role. Maybe gender is a construct. Maybe society is telling me these are things that I don't have to subscribe to. So.
Heoli, I want to hear your take on this, especially because for those that don't know, I'm actually a student of Heoli's, and she is basically the person that taught me Indigenous queer feminism. And so this is not the person. I don't want to exclude all the other wonderful professors, but we've gotten to have a lot of extensive conversations together about you know, the role that Indigenous queer feminism plays in combating even our understanding of the gender binary and patriarchy. So I'd really love to hear your Mana'o.
All right, then. I was trying to get out of it. Okay, so the truth is, it was exclusively Indigenous feminists and Indigenous non-feminists who really just brought me into the conversation of seeing the value in feminism in the first place, and then revealed to me all of what I was missing from women of color feminists, in particular Black feminists, and the incredible work that was being done to talk about and push back and smash the patriarchy. And for me personally, what I needed was the analysis that pointed at the relationship between patriarchy and colonialism. Because I was so, and continue to be, like, kind of hyper focused on decolonizing Hawaii and deoccupying Hawaii and demilitarizing Hawaii and smashing white supremacy and all this stuff. But growing up, my experience with feminism was something that I felt really estranged from, and I felt didn't really represent me in any way. And so I actually got into a lot of arguments with my mother, who is a wonderful, loving Haole woman who, you know, identified as a feminist, and I was like, I don't identify as a feminist, that ain't me. And it took a lot of unlearning to see the ways that feminism has done and can continue to do so much great work for our people. And so, like Jen mentioned about kind of the blowing up of gender roles, the dismissing, the throwing away of these things, like that's been really important in terms of smashing the patriarchy and feminism in particular. But what's been most important is really this decolonial Indigenous analysis of governance and colonialism, and how Indigenous feminists have made it so clear, Indigenous queer feminists have made it so clear to me as a reader and as an Indigenous person who, like, walks on the earth, made it so clear that I really needed to reapproach what I thought decolonization was. And so, yeah, it's about gender roles, but it's also about governance, and it's about our relationship to land, and it's about our relationship to each other and our families. And it's about really starting to see all the ways that we have been displaced out of these intimacies that has had the most profound effect on me as not just a thinker and an activist, but as a human being. So I think it's really important, though, to make space for all the ways that Indigenous and some, like, women or trans people of color may or may not identify as feminists. I think of people like Haunani K. Trask, who her first major work was a feminist analysis and very much identified as a feminist. And then towards the latter part of her writing career, she disavowed feminism and said, like, there's this question of feminism is not useful to me. And I do believe if she was continuing to produce writing at this point, that she probably would have gone back and forth on this same question. But that's kind of work that we need to do and unpack and make space for. And it's in that interrogating and accepting of this movement, this critique, that I think a lot of the really difficult questions are pursued around what it means to smash the patriarchy. So I just want to hold space for all those Wahine ancestors who may or may not have found an affinity with that field or community.
We're getting some more questions in, but before we start taking some questions from the audience, I have one last question that kind of touches on the the interrogation of the family and as, you know, of our homes as a place of governance and a place of power, and how this, you know, reclamation of your identity and this journey of coming to acceptance and honor who you are, with your gender and, you know, sexual identity, if those reclamations have helped transform your understanding of not just your own immediate family and your own, you know, nuclear family, but family in general, and how you see, you know, smashing the patriarchy and the dismantling of patriarchy is impacting our families that that aren't, you know, designated, you know, with just men and women in the household. Like, how does your understanding of family, how is it expanded to include, you know, like gender diverse and trans people in our reconfiguring of community and family?
I can hop in just because. Everything I know about my ancestors tells me that the nuclear family is a joke, right? Just everything I know about my ancestors tells me that. And I could give a real brief, like 101 way that this looks, right? So in the Hawaiian ohana, everything is determined by, what's the word? Not genealogy, well, it is genealogy, but generations, right? So the words we have to define our relationship to people is generationally based. Anyone in my generation is my hoahano. That's a word we often use today to mean cousin, but it literally just means like friend who I'm born beside, related to. Anyone a generation above is my makua. Anyone 2 generations above is my pupuna. Anyone below me is my keiki. Anyone 2 generations below me is my mo'opuna. What this does, right, is it expands our notion of ohana. The nuclear family is a severing of those relations in order, and this is one of the great things I learned from feminism, right, is that it gave me a layered anti-capitalist critique to understand how that nuclear family functions and maintains a capitalist and colonial regime, right? So if I like cut off all my pilina to all these people, then I can make this beautiful, strange family with the mom and the dad and the 2.5 kids and the dog and the picket fence, and we all own one house and we participate in capitalism in a particular way. And so I do think of this as like a reduction and a severing. The nuclear family is a way of cutting us off from each other and our land. In terms of how this relates to our the responsibilities that are tasked to men and women, personally, I'm still trying to unpack the difference between balance and equality, between kuleana, responsibility and privileges, and exclusion. And again, like probably the word I say over and over today, right, and every day, is it all comes back to intimacy and pilina and the relationships we have with each other and the relationships we have to the sacred. Because it's not like work wasn't divided between kane, wahine, and mahu in the society I come from. And I use those words really specifically, right, because they aren't the same thing as men, women, and trans folks. Kane, wahine, and mahu, the idea that that is the same thing as men, women, and trans is also a reduction, right? There's something happening in the translating of these words, because to be completely honest, we don't know if kane, wahine, and mahu are genders. We don't know if they are sexes. We don't know if they are something else entirely that is not intelligible to us. But we do know that the work was divided and that people had particular kuleana. And so the more I dive into that kuleana, the more I really want to think about the sacred, right? When we say that work is kapu te kane, we're not saying this work is exclusively for kane. I think we're saying that we need to understand the relationship between kane, that work, and what makes it sacred. Does it have to do with that kane's relationship to that aina or to a particular akua? But I also understand, and this is something that I think Ilima Long has taught me a lot. I also understand that I don't live in this time of only natives, right? And so we need a feminist critique to unpack the way we have traditionalized patriarchy into our practices. And we've even naturalized patriarchy into the reading of our traditions. And so I think of someone like Ilima or even Chris Finley, who says we need to historicize our traditions. When I think about reclaiming these teachings, the first step is I have to, one, try to understand them within their own context, which is really important, right? Because plenty of Haole people have come and looked at our history and said, oh, you see, you have patriarchy too, because men and women do different work. So the first thing is like, how can we understand this in our own that context? But then two, which is really important and for me much more difficult, is how do I find a way to apply these traditions ethically and meaningfully into a very different context that I now live in, that is completely like running ragged with patriarchy and homophobia and all these other things. When we face this, we remember again, right? Colonialism has created this rupture that hasn't allowed these traditions to kind of move naturally, to flow naturally into 2020. So that part of the work is still like very much needed to be done. Patriarchy is here. There's no way around that. I can't ignore it. I have to face it while taking seriously that the teachings of my kupuna can offer me an alternative, but it's not as easy as just trying to live like my kupuna, because we are faced with challenges that may need also new solutions as well as old ones. Yeah, so that's how I think about all those things in one place, I think.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Osorio, and for all of your insights. I feel like my mind is just so like blown. And there are a lot of things that I really related to in what you said, especially when you were saying that the idea of the nuclear family is a joke. And I even wrote here in my notes, like, the nuclear family is a sham. And it's a colonial and patriarchal sham that puts women in a subordinate or dependent position to men in order for the family to participate in capitalism and men hold economic power, which is like everything in the capitalist world. So those are my ideas around this particular question. And I really liked when you were describing like the familial roles or roles in the family being like sacred work. And it kind of just made me think of the roles in like maybe pre-colonial Philippines, where like a lot of like labor was shared within the community, especially like childcare. So that wasn't like necessarily like a mother's work, it was like the work of like the whole community. So that's what that brought up for me.
Thank you both. You've got me thinking about how we have, like, as we proceed knowing what we know and like what we've discussed, like we really have to like imagine what we want these roles to mean, and like it's really up to us to like, because I'm only working with like colonized English. It's like it feels like I have this opportunity to really fully expand what it means, what gender means. And it doesn't have to be limited to, like, I really liked when you said kane, wahine, and mahu doesn't translate to man, woman, trans, because I think that the English word should mean so much more than that too, especially non-binary and trans. Like, it doesn't have to be so limited. And it's really up to us as we learn and unlearn to create this world that we want to see, using what it is that we have from our ancestors who we're in touch with, and what we learn just kind of through conversations like this. So it's really, it's like we're in a pretty shitty situation. Patriarchy has got us down, but like we have conversations like this, and we have our understandings of ourselves, and we're continuing to learn. And so it allows us to be able to kind of shape what gender is going to mean going into the future and like in our daily lives. And so yeah, patriarchy sucks, but at least we've got this.
I just wanted to add something too, because both Alex and Jen in different ways brought to my mind one of the important things that we need to continue to do is bring Arcane into this space, right? Both to like smash the patriarchy because they're benefiting from a system that subordinates women, but also from this like indigenous feminist analysis, right? They are participating in a system that subordinates them as indigenous people or people of color. And so as, you know, Alex reminded me of like how important that part of the work is. And then Jen talking about this imagining work, right? The work of creating the future we want just makes me want to say over and over again to those who are like struggling with the things that we're talking about or struggling with the world that we're living in. It was great advice put to me years ago that when I don't know what to do, follow Indigenous, Black, queer, and trans people because they know the way, because they are actively creating the way, because we cannot survive in the world that we live in right now, right? So who better to create the future we need and that will liberate all of us than the folks who are dying in the world that we're living in right now. Like follow the people who are really fighting to imagine something else. And so I just wanted to call that out because I don't know the mix of the people who've signed on to this webinar, and maybe we have some folks who were curious and have no idea what the hell we're talking about. But I feel a lot of hope in that, right? Like the present, I said this to my friend the other day, mostly about COVID, but the present is dark, but the future is bright. And it's because, you know, folks like Jen and Alex and Sarah, like they're imagining something else. So that's pretty beautiful, I think.
Heoli, you're absolutely a part of that too. So don't forget that we're bringing you along for the ride. We're imagining all together because we can't do it without each other. And we have a couple more questions coming in. On one end, one question is if folks could discuss, particularly Dr. Osorio, about Mahu and Mahu identity. This person saying that they had a hard time understanding Mahu identity growing up because it was always shame, and not talked about. And then also Jen, somebody wanted to express that they agreed with you about the Mauna and about the safe spaces or the brave spaces on the Mauna. And they're wondering how does that translate now into our other spaces, into our home spaces and work spaces? And how can we foster that same kind of energy and solidarity in spaces that aren't necessarily as sacred as Mauna Kea?
I don't remember the first question, so if Jen wants to answer the second question and then Sarah can re-ask the first.
Sure, I can try. I remember the second one. I think, and I think Dr. Osorio kind of touched on like sacred work, but I think every space, like as long as there's two beings, two humans or more, or even just one person, it's a sacred space. And I think that we've forgotten that because of colonization. We're sacred beings, and land is sacred too. And so no matter where we are, I think that if we can invite that in and remember that when we're engaging with one another, we can create that sacredness. But like I said, colonization has really messed us up. So it's tough to get to that space unless we're doing the work, the internal work that can create acknowledgement of the sacredness in one another. But yeah, I think it's possible. Just gotta work together on that.
Imagine, oh yeah, go ahead. Ask me what's the question?
The question is if you and the other panelists can talk a bit more about Mahu identity. This person heard a lot about it growing up, but they want to know more because it was always like shamed and not talked about in a context that would be like educational or informative.
Word. So same. I grew up not in my family, but in Hawaiian spaces. The only time I heard Mahu, it was definitely not a compliment. It was definitely the butt of a joke or something to be used to try to make someone small. I don't know a lot about Mahu, and I make a really specific and intentional choice to tell people that because they assume that since I'm like queer presenting and kind of like I practice queer relationships and I talk about relationships and intimacy, that I must know a lot about mahu. And it's not actually a focus of my research because it's such a big thing that I just was kind of too scared to dive into it. But I will say that, in my opinion, the best person in this moment to learn from about mahu, what that means historically and today, is Kahala Johnson. And that answer may surprise people. Someone else might pop into the front of their mind, but to me, there's no one doing the work better in a more intersectional way, in a more ethical and decolonial way than Kahala Johnson. And so I'm not sure he has anything like published right now that folks can read, but I'll try to find stuff and maybe get it back to the organizers, and maybe there's a way to get it to folks who are asking. But yeah, look them up because they're dope and they're doing the work.
We have another question that just came in. If you could all talk about the commodification and fetishization of LGBTQ+ and feminized bodies, or femme people, and what are the similarities or what are the trends that you've kind of observed, and how, what can a feminist analysis bring forth in these conversations?
Something that comes up for me with this question is, like with gendered violence or violence against women under patriarchy in the LGBTQ+ community, like it's interesting to see how prevalent it is for trans women to be more subject to this gendered violence. Not to say that like trans men don't fully like experience gendered violence, but especially trans women. And I think that there's, I don't know, trans women kind of experience that more so than trans men. Sorry.
Could you maybe talk about how that connects with the overarching, you know, patriarchal violence, and how even in our, you know, spaces where they're kind of, you know, leftist or socially more liberal, we're still seeing, you know, this harm for trans women, especially Black trans women, and how a feminist analysis kind of advocates and provides a way of kind of eradicating that violence and holding space for trans women.
Right. Well, if your feminism isn't protecting trans women, then it's like not feminism. That's what I have to say about that. Like, Black trans women need to be protected by every practicing feminist, or not protected, but more so like defended, because I don't know, all of our liberations of like women and non-men, people of the global majority, like rest with like destroying the patriarchal systems that harm us, you know. I don't know.
I guess this might be a good point too to talk about, you know, we're talking about holding space and creating space and you know, imagining and creating a world that's better, it's more just, it's liberated, it's protecting the most vulnerable and targeted. So what is an act of solidarity that makes you feel seen? And we're also getting a question that's asking how, oof, I keep messing up the slides, I'm sorry. I'm not the best tech person, everybody. I'm sorry if there's tech delays. We're getting a question of someone asking how white queer women can support queer, trans, and LGBTQ+ Black and Indigenous people of color in Hawaii in this decolonization like process. So kind of two questions about solidarity, one more to your personal experience and what makes you feel seen, and then another, I guess, more widespread question.
I feel so bossy every time I go first. Just sitting here. Okay, solidarity. What acts of solidarity? I think solidarity can be a really fantastic thing, but from where I'm standing right in this moment, it's not always the right word or the thing I'm looking for most from people. I don't always need like fellow soldiers in the fight. Most times I just need people to own up to their own shit and like take on their responsibilities. And I think we do a disservice to ourselves and others when we consider that like solidarity work. Like that's just your kuleana. And so like from an example, right? Today and every day I always speak as when I'm in Hawaii as an Indigenous person standing in Hawaii. If you're in Hawaii and you're not Hawaiian, don't buy land. That's like the greatest act of solidarity or owning your responsibility that you can do. Don't create more mechanisms that further alienate Hawaiians from our aina, i.e. buying land or putting up fences or blocking the shoreline. Stand up to those acts against your friends who are doing those things. And I know that first one is probably going to be kind of off-putting to people. Like, we're not supposed to buy land. I'm like, no. And ultimately, I would like none of us to buy land. I don't think it makes sense to have this transactional relationship with our aina. But I say that as someone who just bought a house, so, you know, I got contradictions, whatever. But other things, like if you've been here for a while and you want to stay and you're not Hawaiian, I think folks should learn to speak Hawaiian. I think there's enough opportunities here that if you have the privilege to afford to live in Hawaii, and to make that choice, you most likely have opportunities to learn the language. And not as a way that you can use it and say you're Hawaiian, because if you don't have genealogy, you're not going to be Hawaiian, right? But as a way for you to learn the history of this place and to better understand your relationship to this place. I think people need to understand that their presence here has an impact. And there's no such thing as like neutral settlement, right? There's always an impact. So yeah, that to me, I can tell when people are doing that work, whether it's trying to learn the language, trying to learn the history, asking the right questions, taking on the labor that they should be taking on. And I know that these things are difficult. And I know that being in Hawaii as someone who's a settler means that you need to be ready to be challenged by Indigenous people. And that's, I think a lot of this is a part of like owning our own responsibility and being in this place. And yeah, some people might call that solidarity and some people might just say like, you're just doing your job as a human. So yeah.
For me, so I really like the points that Dr. Osorio just made. Yeah, that was really great. Like as far as like affirming me and like my gender or whatever. Yeah, it's just like I'm a human being. So if you just treat me as like a human, that's really all I ask for. I think that's solidarity, and I don't. For some reason, that seems like it's like a tall order for some people, but yeah, that's really the biggest act that I could ask for.
And imagine if people not just treated you as a human being, but like treated you as sacred, like you said, right? Anytime there's a person like that's sacred work. Yes. Like, yeah, show up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like treating your relationships as sacred, because your relationships are activism and your relationships are part of the work. And I think the greatest act of solidarity for me is to show, like, for anybody to just show up for like their people, their communities, and yeah. that's impactful.
So we're getting one last question. I think we have time for one more, and it's kind of circling back to what a feminist analysis can do to address commodification of land and the commodification of fetishized and commodification / fetishization of LGBTQ plus and feminized bodies. And they're asking if you can talk a bit about the contemporary efforts in Hawaii that people are kind of waging, and in our communities especially, against identifying ourselves as sacred beings and allowing ourselves to exist as autonomous sovereign beings. And if you can talk about those relationships, like as we've seen the commodification of land, not just in Hawaii, but in many other occupied and colonized places. We also saw the commodification of non-men. We saw the commodification of our women. We saw, the increase in sex trafficking, and we still see that today, unfortunately. And those are directly connected, right? Because these systems weren't in place before, colonizers, missionaries, the British came. So if you could kind of talk to that and how feminist analysis really brings those two issues to the center.
So I'm just gonna say a little bit about this because I don't want to put my foot in my mouth to say something that's not true. But the way I'm thinking about this in this moment is feminism has taught me more about capitalism than probably any other field that I've studied. And my feminist critique, along with my understanding of a Maoli indigenous way of relating to land, and what I've learned about aloha aina through reading some of our really old stories in Hawaiian, is how disruptive it is, this idea that we can buy land. And it is not a surprise to me that if we think we can buy land, our ancestor, right, our family member, and if we think we can then, buying that land means that we can dig into her and then develop her for our own purpose so that we can maximize our profits or do whatever that's going to make us happy, then it is not surprising to me that we think we can buy women, at all. It's not a big leap for me. So people who are surprised by the fact that there is all this violence against non-men, and the trafficking of young people and women and trans folks, it's not surprising to me, living in this capitalistic world that says we can do this to this thing that we have said is more sacred than anything else in the world and actually gives us our sacredness. And so I just want to kind of put that out there as something that we often take for granted. And I don't do that as a way to sensitize us to the violence against people and our bodies. But I do want us to understand that it's not actually a far logical leap from the two things, that they're very much connected. And so we need to actually approach both of these things together. It is not a single approach. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Dr. Osorio. This question really reminds me of the work that we do with From Hawaii and how we try to build that bridge and make connections between both land and women being sacred and not for conquest. So, yeah.
Sure. And I mean, you basically both covered it all, but it really does come down to, remembering this. Why I was see me as a human is because I think that the erasure of my humanity and of my sacredness allows what you both were just talking about. It allows that digging into land, which is sacred, which is alive. And it's and it's the same with women, to what happens for non-men. It's just the erasure of that sacredness or that humanity or that life. It's important that they kind of think of it that way.
And I think in highlighting those connections, right, that kind of perfectly summarizes our relationship as, non-white people and as, not necessarily cis, straight, people that, you know, identify with this heterosexist kind of structure, you know, it highlights that our experiences, right, and us navigating all these different movements and places, it's not informed, right, by half of ourselves, you know, or a part of ourselves, right? Like, you know, my identity, my being is connected to the land I'm from, you know, and it is the same for all of us. And it's the same when we think about the way we express our gender identity and our sexuality, you know, it's connected deeply to the practices of the people that let us be here, you know, the people that fought so hard so that we could exist, you know, so that we could be brought into a space and be brought into community together, right? To kind of wage this war against this, you know, hetero-sexist patriarchy that oppresses our land, that oppresses our homelands, and it also oppresses ourselves and our kin, you know, our community. And we see that as a further extension of like this much broader system of, you know, like colonialism and imperialism meshing together. And again, those are the connections that, you know, white feminism leaves out. These are the connections that, you know, this mainstream LGBTQ pride-centered, you know, capitalist project leaves out. And it's really in us coming together that I think, you know, people are beginning to understand more and see the importance of these connections between, you know, land and the global majority, land and women, land and non-binary people, land and trans folk, you know what I mean? Like, this is not, like you said, this is not something that's far-fetched, Haley. You know, this is our intimate, connected, lived experience. And it's not something that we can detach ourselves from. And like Alex said, you know, we're not for conquest. Our land isn't for conquest and our bodies aren't either. And I think that's so beautiful about us coming together and being able to talk about this in a space that's, you know, we get that, right? Like, I feel like sometimes, you know, there's LGBTQ spaces or feminist spaces that are dominated by white women where they don't understand this, you know, and when we kind of try and bring our whole selves, it feels like they don't understand where we're coming from. You know, they don't understand our experiences as transnational people, as, you know, people that are coming from places of the world that don't connect with the West, or their only connection to the West was through imperialism and occupation and colonialism. You know, this is a very unique experience that some people, you know, have trouble making space for, but we are the global majority. You know, we are the uprising, we are the revolution. And so I think that's something that's really beautiful to kind of center in this conversation, right? Is that we're not alone. We're unique, you know, we're special, but we're absolutely not alone. We're here together, you know, miles and miles apart. We're all connecting on Zoom and through all these beautiful, beautiful platforms to be able to share our stories and to share, you know, the importance of the work that we're doing, not just in, you know, our society, not just in our community, but internally, right? Like in our families, in our homes. This is really like what's going to ignite this mass mobilization of people to understand these connections. And so I'm very grateful to have just been able to hear you all speak, because it's such an honor to hear, you know, such amazing, wonderful people that I look up to. You know, I can say for every single one of you that I was talking about being like a fangirl for everyone's work before when we were meeting. And it's so true, you know, like we're all here because we see this vision, right? And we want to support each other in that vision. And so we're about to wrap up, but in supporting our visions for each other, you know, our comrades, our community, there's going to be a vigil held tomorrow in Makiki at 3:30 p.m. on the corner of Pi'ikoi Street in Makiki, and it will be a community sign-waving demonstration against the recent femicide that happened in Makiki, and we're going to come together in community to officially establish Makiki as a femicide-free zone, and you know, stand up against the patriarchal violence and the you know, the Western normalization of violence that hurts our community and hurts our kin so much. And so we really want to encourage folks to go there. You can find out more information at the Commission on the Status of Women Facebook and Instagram, which is at Status of Women Hawaiʻi. And in a little less than a month, to celebrate Jen's amazing leadership and the celebration of the Gender X bill that went into effect on, was it June 1st or July 1st?
July 1st.
July 1st. So it's been a month that it's been in place, which is so exciting. There's going to be a celebration at Waiʻanae Satellite City Hall to celebrate your ability to get the gender X marker on your license. And it's especially encouraged that as many people get the X as possible. Like when we're talking about solidarity, you know, even if you don't identify as non-binary or use they, them pronouns, if we all get the X, it'll make sure that our community and our kin are actually a lot more protected, because then it's not going to be a shock. You know, we want to normalize having an X, not having to declare, you know, yourself within the binary. So we really want to shout out Jen and all their work in working on this bill. And yeah, make sure to show up, you know, we're talking about solidarity, show up and come out to these wonderful revolutionary acts of, you know, defiance against all that is Western and colonial and oppressive. And with that, we would really like to thank everybody that came and joined us today. We had so many wonderful questions, and it's so beautiful to see this much engagement from people, and you know, this keen interest in engaging about these issues, because they need to be at the forefront, right? These issues, these conversations, these need to be centered. And we're really honored that we were able to have this, oh no, my screen sharing stopped. We're really honored that we got to be able to have this opportunity to share together. So mahalo everyone for coming out, and hang on, sorry, I don't know what's going on. Thank you everyone for coming out, and we hope you have a wonderful day. And make sure that if you want to attend any of these events, that you follow up with the Status of Women Hawaii Instagram account. Mahalo everyone for coming, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.
Mahalo.